Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for spending your lunch hour with us on this Monday. My name is Jenny Morand. I'm the Central Virginia organizer at Virginia League of Conservation Voters. I'm very excited to hold this webinar today with partners from Freedom Virginia, Clean Virginia, Virginia Interfaith Power and Light, Virginia Organizing, Sierra Club Virginia Chapter, and the Virginia Poverty Law Center. I'll now hand it over to our moderator, Paige Westlink. She's the Digital Outreach Coordinator and Data Centers Lead at Sierra Club Virginia Chapter, who's going to lead the discussion with our lawmakers and experts. Take it away, Paige.
Thank you so much, Jenny. And thank you everyone for being here today. We have some wonderful panelists and speakers. And really what we are all here to understand today is how are we being overcharged on our energy bills? And the first thing that we really need to understand to address that question is that Dominion has been overcharging you on your electric bills and continues to do so. Just this past week, I actually spoke to Dominion on the phone because I saw that I had a huge charge on for my bills, like way higher than it used to be. So I gave them a call. And they essentially told me that they had doubled their rates in November 2023. That is a huge amount, a huge difference in amount for people to be paying. And Dominion continues to do this because they have written it into law that they can do so. Something that we're going to be able to understand today is how we can advocate for cheaper energy, which is clean energy, because Dominion continues to invest in natural gas, which is a more expensive energy. It's actually 6 times more expensive than the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative charge that you see on your bill. And the thing about the RGGI charge, which we'll be referring to that as RGGI, you'll hear that a lot, is that charge is going back to people, where the natural gas charge on your bill is actually pollution that is hurting our families and people across the state. But that charge is going back to people by basically investing in our communities through flood resiliency, through ratepayer protections, and ensuring that poor people across our state are not burdened by high energy bills. So today we're really going to be figuring out what is on your bills, what policies can we be advocating for to ensure that cheap, clean energy is being centered in our state, and what we can do as when we come together to ensure that we have a better Virginia for all people. So I really appreciate all of you for being here. Today, we are hearing from a number of wonderful speakers, but first we are hearing from Senator LaSharice Aird. Senator Aird is an advocate for a better Virginia. She has a history of ensuring that those voices that are normally left out of the conversation are actually the centerpiece, especially when we're talking about the environment and when we're talking about climate and justice issues across our state. We are really lucky to have her here today. I know that people have a lot of concerns about pipeline expansion in Virginia and shutoff protections for people, and I know you'll be speaking on a lot more than just that, but I'm interested to hear your insights on that, and I know folks here are too, so let's welcome Senator Aird.
Thank you so much, Paige, for that very kind introduction, and a huge thank you to all of our partners for organizing today's lunch and learn, if you will, about the high cost of energy that we're experiencing in some parts of Virginia and what's on the energy bill. I thought as the first speaker, I would center us. So I want to also just thank my colleagues for being on alongside, and also just everyone who'll be speaking thereafter. I think as we reflect on the work that remains ahead of us, it's important to also note how far we've come. I arrive at the conversation about high energy burden and the needs that exist for the Commonwealth as a whole from an environmental standpoint, thinking about our most vulnerable communities. But I'm very excited that we have made a lot of progress here in Virginia. I think you will probably hear all of us throughout today's call talk about the history that we should continue to applaud with the Virginia Clean Economy Act, which not only was historical for Virginia specifically, but for all those that are impacted, as well as setting a standard for all additional states to follow. I think that because we had an environmental majority in both bodies at that time, we were able to lay a very strong foundation of the type of commonwealth from an environmental standpoint that we want to live in. And while it has been unfortunate that under this new administration, this governor has attempted to roll back some of those protections and some of that progress, I think what you have in a General Assembly now is still two bodies that are fighting tooth and nail back against these efforts that he is making, both through legislation, both through efforts to return us to RGGI, and so much more. And so we have done a lot, but yes, there is a lot to be done moving forward. And so I just think it's important to start there. I just want to quickly talk about some of the legislation that I've been very excited to do with many of the partners on this call. But again, from a place of centering the conversation, I was very excited back in 2020 to establish the Virginia Clean Energy Advisory Board, which was all about trying to get access to solar into the hands of more individuals, particularly those that aren't often able to afford them. So not only setting up a framework for access to solar, but then also the funding component of it. And from there, we've been able to grow and build the work of that board that today, I think, even continues to affect some of what we're talking about around the energy costs that families are experiencing. And so representing Senate District 13 and previously the 63rd District, which is most of the Tri-Cities areas, but now the Tri-Cities area, the South Side, as well as the Eastern Henrico Charles City community, my district experiences some of the highest energy burden costs throughout the Commonwealth, which is why I will be committed, but also remain committed for the long term to these issues that we're discussing. And so this session, one of the most important bills that I had the privilege of working alongside Delegate Irene Shin on was utility protections, utility cutoff protections. And I think it's important to note that this legislation took 3 sessions to actually get across the finish line. And sometimes that's just the reality of the commitment that is required. But this all started back when, during the pandemic, families in the district I represent was experiencing water utility cutoffs during the pandemic, which ironically, what were we telling families at that time? Keep access to your water, keep access to these things because you need them to survive. And so the idea that you would be disconnected is still baffling and unfathomable. But because of this legislation, during health emergencies, extreme weather incidents, either in the winter or in high heat temperatures in the summer, families will not have to worry about that fear. And we go a bit further and even try to put protections on how you can get reconnected. And if you do find yourself in a position where you have your utilities shut off. And so, again, I think going back to that point of because of the commitment of this current structure of this General Assembly, we were able to get that through. I'll also touch base on the fact that I think as we are striving to meet the goals that are laid out in the Virginia Clean Economy Act, we have to charge our local communities with being deliberate and intentional about their planning. And so Senate Bill 595 that I had the opportunity to work on alongside Senator Lamont Bagby really allows for or really asks local communities to incorporate healthy community strategies as part of their comprehensive planning process. So as we attract new entities, and a lot of times that have an impact environmentally, that they're very deliberate about how they will ensure that that has no negative health impacts and negative environmental impacts on that local community as they're inviting in this various types of industries. And so again, that was very exciting to be able to move forward. And one that I regret did not move forward, but remains equally important is Senate Bill 460, maybe. Don't ask me, I'm still trying to remember bill numbers, but basically this has to do with the pipeline. I happen to represent the area where TC Energy is located, and being very deliberate and intentional about if in the event only in the event. God forbid, in the event you have to expand a pipeline, which again, in many instances is counter to what we're trying to accomplish here. But if that has to occur, that we're doing it in the most environmentally efficient way, the most health conscious way, and the most environmentally justifiable way for what causes the least amount of harm to the individuals in that community. And so we were not able to get that legislation passed, but I think my commitment is to make sure that all entities that are continuing to push for the expansion of these types of projects, that they know from an environmental justice standpoint, we are watching, we are paying attention, and we're not just going to stand by while these things are going on and they're having an adverse impact to already vulnerable communities. And so again, I am excited by a lot of the work that we have been able to do previously, the work that we are able to do this past session. And I'm going to leave some bandwidth for my colleagues to also talk about, but I appreciate the opportunity to touch on a bit of those because I do believe they ultimately have an impact on what you're feeling in your pocket, on your energy bill, generally and overall. So thank you again for having me.
Thank you so much, Senator Aird. I really appreciate it. And all the incredible work you're doing with people protections in general. It's really incredible. We will now throw it over to Senator Ghazala Hashmi. Senator Hashmi is a champion for the environment, especially on the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which I briefly brought up earlier. She's a big proponent for clean cars and solar and really just for people. I know that when she ran, she promised to make Virginia better for all Virginians, and she's continued to follow through on that promise through and through. So we will hear from Senator Hashmi, hopefully hearing about the implementation policies around the Virginia Clean Economy Act, which is the most significant climate legislation the South has ever passed. So it made us a leader on climate really across the nation, but especially in the South. And now we are implementing that policy to ensure that we are fossil fuel free by 2050. So really curious to hear more on that, but please welcome Senator Hashmi. And I believe you are on mute.
I am on mute, so
All good.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Paige, for the introduction, and good afternoon to everyone here. Really appreciate everyone joining us, and thank you to my colleague, Senator Aird, for talking so importantly about the ways in which the areas that we're working on impact our local communities, and especially the constituents that we each serve. So these are such important concerns, and you know, you talk a page about the VCEA, and this is just a critical piece of legislation that we need to continue to spotlight because it is a item of legislation that has set up a timeline for us in Virginia to meet, and we have to follow directives in there. I'm personally very concerned about some of the conversation this past session around the VCEA. I've heard words such as aspirational being used around our Clean Economy Act. And I think that's a narrative that we need to really push back on. The goals of the Clean Economy Act are not aspirational. They have to be fundamental and importantly critical for all of us in Virginia, especially if we want to make the kind of progress we need to make in order to respond to a climate crisis. We can't deny the climate crisis. We have to find solutions. And so programs such as this are really essential. We need to continue to make sure everyone is involved in this. Part of that argument is that we're seeing an exponential growth in data centers, demands on our grid. You might have seen articles in the Washington Post and the New York Times that really begin to undermine the goals that we've set in the VCEA in terms of converting to renewable energy, making sure that we are carbon free. And so those narratives are coming from some sectors, and they need to be analyzed, and they need effective responses. We tried to do that this past session through a variety of legislation. I'll just highlight a few of those items that I was working on, as well as some of my colleagues. We had a bill that I was carrying on the parking lot solar fund, and I thank the Piedmont Environmental Council for really working very hard to get this on the across the finish line. Unfortunately, it was continued on to 2025, but this would have established a pilot program in Richmond City as well as in Chesterfield County, my two districts, so that we could begin to encourage the development of distributed parking lot solar projects, so that we are using up spaces and that are already in place, and being able to use those for our parking lot projects rather than using farmlands or forest lands that we want to preserve, certainly. That again was continued on to 2025, but I'm hopeful that we will be able to come back and revisit that. One bill that we were able to successfully pass is the Inclusive Utilities Act, and this directs the SCC to convene a work group. That wasn't the original goal of the bill, but this is what we were able to get across, convene a work group to study the implementation of energy upgrade programs for eligible customers who are opting in to participate. And so this would help our customers be able to install energy projects such as rooftop solar and other smaller projects, and then would defray those upfront costs that oftentimes stand in the way of customers being able to use those. So again, that has gone to a study, and we hope that we will be able to bring that next year. Now, a couple of other bills that we focused on that really help to move the needle in meeting the goals of the VCA. One bill is the SAVE Act, and this establishes by 2029 that we will assess energy efficient programs through the state corporation, the SCC, to determine what is going to be cost effective. And it directs the SCC to establish a single, consistent, cost-effective test that evaluates any proposed energy efficiency programs. And again, an effort to continue to move the needle in ensuring that energy efficiency programs are available to a wide range of individuals. And that was a bill sponsored by my colleague, Senator Deeds. And another bill is the Clean Energy Bank, which was carried by Senator Surville. And this establishes a green bank. This would be the first green bank in Virginia. And it did pass with pretty good bipartisan support in both chambers. And the Virginia Clean Energy Innovation Bank would help to provide through public funds, through grants and loans, opportunities for projects that are really focused on clean energy, energy efficiency, as well as water conservation, and target those projects, especially to our low income communities. So this would be another very, very critical project to continue to deploy resources to make sure we are providing financial support to kick some of these goals off the ground here. And just finally, I'll share the bills on the shared solar project. This is two bills that I think it was Delegate Sullivan was carrying on the House side. They would establish for Appalachian Power customers and also expand availability through Dominion Energy's existing programs, the opportunity for shared solar, community solar, again, allowing customers to buy electricity from solar companies and receive those credits on their electric bills. So those are a few of the areas that we were able to get across. These bills are now in front of the governor, and we certainly hope that the governor will be signing these bills and allowing us to target those projects that are going to move the needle. Again, we can't meet the goals of the VCA unless we prioritize through legislation and through action on these projects, so that we can actually begin to see a shift in the ways in which we're securing the grid, as well as providing customers opportunities to participate in renewable energy at a cost-effective means. So those are some of the highlights, and happy to answer questions at the end of the program. Thank you, Paige.
Thank you so much, Senator Hashmi. Really, really important legislation. Thank you for your work this past session. I will now introduce Delegate Phil Hernandez. Delegate Hernandez has been on the front lines fighting for solutions that really benefit Virginians' families. He has worked on raising the minimum wage to increasing teacher pay and funding K-12 public schools, but he's also a huge proponent for clean air and clean water across our state. And today he's going to talk about the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, really how our state can benefit from that program and has already benefited from that program, because we know it has generated a huge amount of money, and I know we are going to cover that. So excited to hear from you, Delegate Hernandez, and I will let you take the mic.
Thank you so much, Paige, and thank you all for having me today. Thanks to Senator Hashmi and Senator Aird for all of your great work and leadership as well. I'm just hoping to build on your comments that you've made here. I think all of us share so many of the same values around environmental protection, around wanting to establish Virginia as not just a regional leader, but also a national leader when it comes to clean energy and energy efficiency. And I think you saw, continued progress on that front through our legislative actions this year. So I, thinking about the title of this webinar, also sort of what's on my energy bill, I'm thinking back to last year and a lot of the conversations that I had in my district and that I know were happening all across the Commonwealth, which was just the concern about rising costs of living generally and inflation and how people are sort of going to make ends meet. And I'm still hearing about that to some extent. And I think I carried that into this legislative session, particularly focused on energy costs and how can we save ratepayers money on their energy bills. And so I just want to highlight, before I talk a little bit about RGGI, just two quick bills that I carried this past session, both of which currently are sitting on the governor's desk. So fingers crossed. But the first is HB 855. And I have to say, this was probably one of my favorite bills this session because of its clear, direct impact. And if this bill is signed into law, then it'll be easier for families to get assistance paying their energy bills through the low-income home energy assistance program, which we affectionately call the LIHEAP program. And I have to thank the Virginia Poverty Law Center also for their years of work on this. So it's really exciting that this bill is on the governor's desk as we speak. The issue with this program as it stands right now is that if you're a low-income family and you're struggling to pay your energy bills and you want to apply for help through this program, there's a breathtakingly short window to apply for help. We're talking really about just a couple of weeks. And if you miss that window, even by a day, then you're sort of out of luck. But the human consequences of that are real, because imagine sitting in your house on the hottest day of summer without air conditioning, or a frigid day in January without heat. Those are the kinds of scenarios that this bill is trying to prevent. And so if this bill is signed into law, then the Department of Social Services, which is the agency that administers the program, will sort of be able to turbocharge the regulatory process to expand the application window, hopefully to something that looks like year-round or close to it. And DSS wants to do this, but as it stands, that change could take many, many, many years. So this bill will greatly accelerate the timeline and sort of help families. And I think the last thing to note about this is a federally funded program. This is federal dollars. This is not state dollars. And, when the pandemic hit a couple of years ago, the feds poured a lot of money into the LIHEAP program. But the impact here in the Commonwealth was sort of stunted because we weren't able to help as many people because of this very short application window. And so it's a shame in some sense that this reform didn't happen sooner, but it is important still going forward because the federal government also gives more funding to those states that have a year-round application window. So it's a win-win-win no matter how you splice it. And that's probably why it passed with near unanimous support in both chambers. So hoping that the governor can sign the bill and let's get this done. The other bill I wanted to highlight is my HB 862, and wanted to mention that here because it is directly related to saving ratepayers money on their energy bills. It's basically a bill to help us explore the potential of what are known as grid enhancing technologies, GETS for short, in an effort to sort of maximize the current electrical grid and more quickly bring on clean sources of energy. The sort of context for this bill is like, we know two things, right? We know demand for energy is growing. And we also know that sort of the building out of new energy infrastructure projects and also transmission lines takes a lot of money and it takes a lot of time. And so that's why you've seen, I think, growing interest from the US Department of Energy, the US National Labs, others in the private sector in grid enhancing technologies, because they are in many ways the most affordable way to get the most capacity out of our current electrical grid, and they can also help bolster reliability too. And so all this bill does is says, like, when utilities are doing their long-term planning, working with the SEC, they have to do a comprehensive assessment of these technologies. And I think it's interesting to know Virginia really has no bill related to this at all. There's no law around grid enhancing technologies. A lot of states don't have them yet. And so this would make us a leader. It's an important first step. And so I'm excited about that progress. So RGGI, this is a program that is near and dear to my heart. So I'm in Norfolk's 94 district. It's the northernmost part of Norfolk that bumps up against the Chesapeake Bay. We are at sea level. Sea level rise is happening faster here than pretty much anywhere else on the eastern seaboard. I think we're second most vulnerable, second only to New Orleans. And I think what you saw in RGGI fundamentally was a program that was working as intended. You saw reduced emissions, carbon pollution, and you saw for the first time, and this is a really big deal, a dedicated revenue stream for coastal resiliency projects and energy efficiency upgrades in low-income homes. We didn't have a dedicated revenue stream like that before RGGI. It was always sort of part of the budget fights to sort of get resources for those things. So it was a program that was working. There were projects on the ground that were moving forward. We had cleaner air. It was just, it was a sort of textbook. And we have a governor that has pulled us out of it. I think many of us on at least sort of my side of the aisle, our caucus would say illegally, because there was a law that went through the General Assembly and the normal legislative process and was signed into law by Governor Northam. And so it is sort of a travesty because we are losing ground for every month, week that passes that we're not in RGGI that we were before. That is an impact on sort of climate pollution, and that's an impact on funding that we could have to really establish Virginia as sort of the gold standard for resiliency and planning for flooding. So I think we're going to continue to work to make sure that we rejoin RGGI as soon as we possibly can. And I think many of you probably already heard this in the budget, the conference budget that we sent to the governor. We had language in there that requires Virginia to re-enter RGGI. And so I know, I presume that will be a big fight as we work toward a final budget agreement, but I think it is noteworthy that it's in there because it is a priority to us because the benefits are just so clear. So with that, I will stop there and just thank you all again.
Thank you so much, Delegate Hernandez. Yeah, and I think at this point it's over 100 million, over almost 130 million in total for money coming from RGGI alone towards funding in Virginia for projects like what you were just talking about. So it's such a critical program and it's so important. I appreciate you talking about it. And thank you so much. We will now be hearing from two policy experts, that is Carmen Bingham and Chris Layen. Carmen Bingham is with the Virginia Poverty Law Center, and she is the Affordable Clean Energy Project Coordinator. And then Chris Layan is with the Virginia League of Conservation Voters. He is the Policy Director. So thank you both for being here. Excited to hear from you about specifically our utility bills, how we're being charged, and those costs in general. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Paige.
Thanks, Paige. And thank you so much for Senator Aird and Senator Hashmi and Delegate Hernandez. They have all been really good champions in helping to maintain the progress that Virginia is making in transitioning to a Clean Economy Act and protecting those most vulnerable among us in the rising costs that some of that policy does just naturally bring along with it. So we really do appreciate all of the work that you all three are doing to help us here in Virginia and to make sure that we're staying along this path.
So we wanted to dive
thank
in
you, Chris. Go ahead.
to a couple of questions. First and foremost, sort of just starting with what is the role and process of the State Corporation Commission, and when just why does the ratepayer take on the burden and cost of utility fees generally? Like, well, how do we arrive at this system? And I think the first thing is just pulling back the curtain and doing a little 101. Utilities are a regulated monopoly. This is how the electric systems were determined to be best regulated to provide reliable service. And, so you didn't have sort of a pure competitive marketplace with like 7 people trying to provide transmission lines to connect their power to these users.
Right. And remember that when electricity service started, it was actually seen as a luxury for those who could most afford it, and not a necessity like it is today.
But because everyone needs to at some point be able to afford it, usually costs are controlled through competition in a sort of capitalist marketplace. But with a regulated monopoly, there is no competition. So sort of what serves as that cost cap is the regulatory agency.
Right. And that's what's called the regulatory compact. And so it's what we have in Virginia is called a cost of service rate making, where customers pay for everything from paper clips to power plants. And each state regulates their own electricity utility systems, which are independently charged agencies that started by regulating the railroads, then went on to electricity and then telecommunications.
That's fascinating. The inclusion of telecommunications is kind of fun there, because since you call people in from Virginia and New York or California, a lot of telecommunications has shifted primarily to the FCC. But when it comes to things that are still dealt with at the state level, the regulatory authority that we have is the State Corporation Commission, or more commonly referred to as the SCC.
And in other states, the Virginia SCC is unique in that other states are generally referred to as their Public Utility Commission, and they regulate just the public utilities. However, in Virginia, they aren't just focused on utility regulation. Sorry, Chris. We actually focus at the SCC actually focuses on regulating utilities that include water, gas, electric, but then also on regulating our insurance businesses and our financial institutions. So they do a lot for a three-member commission here in Virginia.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Carmen. So I think what we wanted to sort of wrap up the tail end of our discussion with y'all on was the structure of a utility bill. So that what is actually on it, by taking a look at some of this. Paige or Jenny, is it possible while we're chatting to make sure that Carmen has share privileges so we can bring up a graphic of a sample bill and sort of walk some folks through that?
Yeah, that's great. I will see. I think Jenny might have to do it.
Thanks, y'all.
Okay.
So first off, we get this question often, which is like, why is Dominion allowed to build expensive projects? So, or why are utilities allowed to build things that we see as potentially customers as something that's costly?
Right. And as I said earlier, what we have in Virginia is called a cost of service rate making process. And what that means is it's founded on that the customer of the utility, of the monopoly utility that is regulated, pays for everything that the utility does to provide the electric service to the customer. So that's everything, again, from the power plants that generate the electricity to the wires that actually take that power from the generation facility to the distribution hubs, and then onto the distribution hubs to all of the wires that go to all of our houses and businesses across the Commonwealth, as well as what it takes to operate and maintain that grid here in Virginia. So this is similar to like a regular business practice, where if you go and buy a loaf of bread at the store, you assume that the cost of making that bread, employing the people to bake it, the ovens to bake it, the electricity to bake it, is all included in that cost of the bread that you are for that loaf of bread that you're paying. But because there is competition, there is a check on those normal businesses, those competitive businesses, that makes sure that that price of that loaf of bread is not so outrageous that it's priced out of your range and you wouldn't be able to use it. The regulatory compact, which I mentioned before, is that check. So the regulatory agency makes sure that that price that you're paying for your electric service kind of comes to a place that is fair, just, and reasonable for you as the customer.
Right, that just and reasonable rate is sort of the default. But I think for some good and some not so good reasons, depending on who you talk to, the energy policy of the Commonwealth is set by the legislature and sometimes takes into consideration things other than customers' rates that can help provide guidance to the SEC as to what's necessary. Carmen, could you walk us through sort of a couple of examples in recent history where like what is necessary changed in a meaningful way?
Sure. So there's been a lot of legislation that has happened over the past few years. Starting with the most recent, in 2020, we had the Clean Economy Act, which our legislators here have hit upon and touched upon, and most people on this call probably are very well aware of. Prior to that, we had legislation in 2019 that specifically required a RAC, or rate adjustment clause, to the bills in order to pay for the coal ash cleanup that was coming to light from all of the coal ash ponds that were leaking across the Commonwealth. In 2018, we also had the Grid Transformation and Security Act. And just prior to that was the 2016 Rate Freeze Act. And all of these things had impacts on our customers' bills, from actual RACs or actual adjustments to our rate bases. I'm sorry.
Oh no, you're good. I want to tie in one of those. So something like the coal ash cleanup is a good example of where when we talk about the cost of energy, where the cost of burning that coal and transporting it and distributing energy powered by it was what folks who paid for it back in the day saw as the cost of coal. But as we've learned, the cost of health to the communities that breathe in the emissions from those power plants, the cost to future generations of actually cleaning up and taking care of the land that's been impacted by choosing to use that fuel source. Those are some of the other costs that sometimes even that just and reasonable determination of cost doesn't factor in, at the moment that energy is generated. And that gets to sort of that the model that we have in Virginia is not the only way to factor in safety, public health, climate action, or even principles like energy conservation that can save you money on your bill. I think right now we have one of the ways that we direct sort of public good at the regulatory level is something called an in the public interest designation. Not sort of an outside source, but saying just generally this is something that's in the public good, like little p, public interest, little p, little I, but like officially from the legislature will determine something's going to be in the public interest. And that can be for a variety of reasons. But it can be a way to sort of give adders an additional ways for the utility to get compensation for doing those activities. I think we've seen resolutions passed this year to look at maybe there's another way we can do this, something like a performance-based regulation, which is an alternative model to this cost of service system where instead of being compensated just for building things and for providing as much electricity as possible, there are financial incentives built in for monopolies hitting those other public goods. So energy efficiency rates, customer service standards, reliability, or having a clean energy portfolio. And that's sort of so we walked you through a little bit of the history, a little bit of players, and now we're going to take a chance to sort of look at your energy bill. And as we do that, we'll look at sort of the purpose of what's called the base rate versus what we just referred to as RACs, or rate adjustment clauses. So the base rate is sort of the foundation of your bill. So the cost of operating utility, maintaining the electricity infrastructure, right? Everything that goes into baking that loaf of bread that Carmen was talking about. And what are some of those things, Carmen, that are traditionally incorporated into a base rate?
So the things that are usually in a base rate are all of those things that typically are kind of like your base service. So it's going to be those initial transmission poles and lines and distribution poles and lines, the initial generation plants when the services prior to 2009, because that is when we went to this new kind of hybrid cost of rate making system where we have RACs and base rate. So everything that the utility owned and operated prior to 2009 are all in the base rate. And recently, as in last year, there was legislation passed that allowed for 3 different RACs to be included in the base rates during this most recent rate case that Dominion went through. So we do have some new generation that are in those, but it also includes like the operation and maintenance of the system itself. So any upgrade, when you see trucks out there that are actually trimming away the trees and brush from the power lines, that's included in your base rate. All of that kind of maintenance that they have to do in order to make sure that that service can be provided to their customers is included in the base rate.
Thank you. Man, I have some conversations to have with those base rate people who cut my trees. So the other than the base rate, as Carmen alluded to in 2019 with the coal ash cleanup, the other way to recover costs for services provided are through RACs. So these are for like specific projects for generation and distribution. So I think the easy way to think about this is when you take a loan out to put an addition onto your house, you sort of know that set cost, and it can be incorporated separately.
Right. And so what I've got here on the screen is just a page from an APCO customer's bill. And I apologize, this is pre-RGGI. So this is not a current bill. This is one before we were in RGGI. And you can see here under the current APCO charges, APCO's is slightly different than Dominion's. And I'm using APCO's because it's a lot easier to explain than it is Dominion's because it's very complicated. And I apologize to everyone for that. But we were limited on time. So this is the easiest way to explain it. And it kind of correlates to Dominion's. They have their residential tariff, which is what all of us as residential customers would have on our bill. You have a tariff that is the rate that we as normal residential customers pay. And that is based on your usage, your monthly usage. So you can take your kilowatt hours, you can look at the tariff to see what the price per kilowatt hour is. And that's the price that you will pay. It should calculate out to this base rate, basically. And then we have some additional RACs. So one of the RACs that you'll have is this fuel factor RAC, which is a dollar for dollar pass through. That is the cost that the utilities incur to actually operate their generation plants. And that is passed on per law, dollar to dollar. That means without any additional return on equity or profit rate, as some people shorthand it, to the utility. So it literally is their cost, and it is then passed on to the customers. Then we have some additional racks here called the transmission services racks. So these are for very specific projects that APCO has undertaken that are added onto your bill, and the life of this rack on your bill correlates to the life of the rack to pay off the actual project. So that is something that when we switch to this new cost of service, not new cost of service, but this new hybrid of cost of service, which allows us to do base rates and racks. The racks are specific for the project. As Chris said, once that loan is paid off, then that rack comes off your bill. The same with these distribution services. And just so you understand too, a distribution service also means demand side management, which are things like energy efficiency programs. So this is a rack where you would be paying for your energy efficiency programs. So if you participated in any of them, all customers pay for them, but if you happen to be a participant in one of them, then this is where that rack is paid. And then the other things are very self-explanatory. You've got your electric consumption tax and then your local consumers tax. And that is essentially what makes up your utility bill.
One of the things that we are looking forward to as we transition away from fossil fuels is sort of, if you look at that fuel factor line, the ability to sort of reduce volatility in that line on your bill by having renewable sources that don't rely on prices that can sort of fluctuate based on geopolitical factors, based on other issues as we transition away from those fossil fuels. So I know we saw that was one of the major drivers when we saw energy bills spike. I believe it was last summer, was seeing that fuel factor cost go skyrocketing way high as folks relied on natural gas that got what became much more expensive. And I think so some of the I know we've got some questions that have hit in the chat while this bill is up. You mentioned this tariff on residential service. So if you were if you're a large scale user, and we know we've seen sort of major recent demand projection increases based on sort of the rapid expansion of data centers and other heavy energy users. But how is the cost of providing service to sort of those other classes of utility users, like how is that reflected on your bill as a residential user? I know things are excluded, like the lines required to plug into the grid aren't covered, and the costs of consuming that energy wouldn't be covered. But are there other costs associated with sort of those large scale energy uses that end up trickling down to the customer?
Well, it depends. Okay. There's two different types of large scale users. There are the non-jurisdictional, and those are the users that actually are allowed to contract directly with Dominion Energy or APCO, depending upon the service territory they're in, or with an outside supplier. So let's just say they put together a solar project for themselves just to power their facility. Those are non-jurisdictional, and typically there's an amount of energy that they have to use. There's a bottom line basically that they have to use every month in order to meet that qualification. And they are ones that are actually opted out of most of these typical racks that we see on our bills. And that is because they are not paying for the generation projects that are producing the electricity that we are using. Therefore, they're not paying for those lines because their source is coming directly from wherever they're getting it. If they do contract with Dominion, they just contract at a lower price because they use so much. And so for them to pay the same rate that we pay, it would be astronomical, and the cost of whatever it is they're producing would include that price in the cost of whatever goods that they're providing for us. And so for those that are non-jurisdictional though, you know, their costs will be recovered through their prices of their goods that they're producing, but it's far less than those who are actually contracting with Dominion or APCO, because they have less fees to pay for their electricity service. And then there are things like certain pilot projects that large customers are not required to have to pay. And again, this is all set by legislation. It's all negotiated out with these large users in order to make sure that the price that they pay for electricity is not overburdensome, so that the cost of whatever it is they're producing comes out at an equitable price for whoever their consumers are, which typically are us, right? Like we're the ones buying those goods. So there are some things that they do not pay for that we as residential customers and commercial customers, there's a difference. Commercial customers are going to be your businesses, like, your Kroger's, your mom and pop shops, your restaurants. Those places are considered commercial businesses. They use considerably more electricity than we do per month, but they pay a different tariff rate than we do, again, mostly because of the amount they consume, and the consistency with which they use the utility service.
Yeah, I know that there is a major concern amongst folks who have been really paying some good attention to this, in looking at those lines where it is the line for generation service plus fuel factor and the line for transmission services, where seeing some of those costs go up, even as your electricity use is flat, is a little bit difficult, and is something that we think the legislature will have to look at some point in the future. If there's a different customer class that's responsible for building out a ton of generation and a ton of transmission, that how we deal with that moving forward is going to be really interesting, especially given that a lot of these recent policy changes have occurred in a period where basically electricity demand was flat, and we were saying, okay, how do we transition this existing flat amount of electricity to cleaner sources? For the first time, we're really starting to see an increase in demand for a lot of electricity and a lot of consistent electricity demand. So you don't have necessarily the same ways that you can sneak around efficiencies, grid transformation technologies, when you have to have always on power. It's going to be a big challenge for the legislature as they navigate this. And Jenny, I know we're probably at time for you. That's your bill. That's your that's the role of the SCC and a little bit of how it's designed. Hope we got to some of the questions in advance.
Yeah, and I see a lot of questioners in the chat. Can we go ahead and answer some of those in the chat itself?
Yeah,
Okay.
that would be great. I know we definitely have a lot of questions that we want to get to. Thank you both so much. That was awesome. There are a number of questions related to Dominion and how the costs are going to be passed on to ratepayers with data center work that's happening across Virginia, and even how Dominion is able to pass on those costs to people. I think that would be a great question for one of the lawmakers, if anyone wants to cover that question and really kind of give an oversight of how we are footing the bill for Dominion, and how that really came to be in our state.
I'll give it a stab here, and Delegate Hernandez might know more than I, but it came to be because it's in the law. And so they have the ability to pass on these costs to the customer. And I know we've seen legislation in the past to address those concerns, and unfortunately we have not been able to make any progress in changing that structure significantly. And someone previously raised a question, well, how come a simple pilot program like parking lot solar can't get across the threshold? And unfortunately, you see people, not necessarily people, but institutions, organizations, industries working constantly behind the scenes on seemingly simple legislation like that pilot program. And part of that is that I personally think that there is an effort to continue to undermine our progress in renewables and to set the system up for not succeeding. And then we create finger pointing opportunities to say, see, renewables cannot support our demand, and therefore we have to rely on fossil fuel. So if we're going to undermine the Clean Economy Act, we're going to do it through methods such as this that impede progress and stop opportunities for really making changes. But I'll defer to the delegate, and I'm sure he has good answers.
Well, I think the senator had a wonderful answer there. I think actually the only thing I would add, and this is only sort of tangential related, is just there for all the things that we didn't accomplish this session, bills that we would have liked to see move forward. There are a lot of bills on the governor's desk, as we noted in our presentations. And so I just want everyone to know, you probably already do, that there is still plenty of time to advocate and make your voices heard. You know, the governor will act until I think it's April 8th on a lot of these bills. So we have a couple of weeks for op-eds, for other advocacy tactics. And I think that's really important because we don't want to take for granted. It is a lot of work to get even one bill through the legislative process, and we want to make sure that we're getting as many of these wins done so that we can focus on other issues sort of going forward. But we need to notch these wins, keep making progress, and then also stay tuned to the budget, because obviously there's a lot of policy related sort of issues in there, and we'll see what the timeline looks like for that. There may be more time for advocacy on that front. But that is also just another important vehicle. So I just wanted to mention that as we're wrapping up here, to keep fighting and to keep advocating.
Absolutely. 100%. There's a lot of the questions in here relating back to data center work, especially these questions around, are we subsidizing businesses and their energy usage? The answer to that question is yes. Absolutely, we are subsidizing, and that is part of the reason why data centers wanted to come here and came here in such large amounts, is because we have those subsidies in Virginia specifically for those businesses. And it's an issue that we definitely need to tackle. I think one of the questions I saw in the chat was, let me make sure I have the right question. Basically about tackling data centers. Oh, I found it. What steps can we take to increase rates for industrial users that are paying that much lower rate than us in Virginia?
And actually, Paige, excuse me for interrupting, but that is a misnomer. Industrial customers actually subsidize residential and customer classes. When you look at the big scale of the entire rate base and the revenue requirement of a utility to provide electric service to their customers, whether it be Dominion or APCO, even though they're paying a much lower rate than we pay as a residential customer, the amount of energy that they are using is a significant, and it's nearly exponentially larger than what we as residential customers pay, or use rather, throughout Virginia. You know, we use this mythical 1,000 kilowatt hour residential customer, where in reality we use closer to 1,100 per month on an average basis here in Virginia. And for low income customers, they actually use a lot more. The amount that industrial customers use, even all of the residential customers combined, they still use more. So we are not subsidizing them. They are by far subsidizing us. But with performance-based metrics, we can actually balance that equity out so that all customer classes will pay what their real fair amount is without it being overly burdensome on one class or the other, and to be affordable for each individual class. So there are ways that we're trying to look at how to balance this out and to keep this fairness balance for the customer classes in place and in check, while still maintaining affordability for, or at least achieving affordability for some of our customers, but maintaining affordability for other customers, such as the industrials and larger businesses.
Thank you, Carmen. I appreciate that.
Thanks.
I know we have a lot of questions and we are at 1:30, 1:31. So I will go ahead and wrap this thing up, and we can make sure that we save the questions and send them out to the panelists afterwards so that they can address them. But I will close this out by just adding that this is such an important thing for us to continue to do, to educate one another, to be knowledgeable, because we know that knowledge is power. In Virginia, Dominion alone overcharged people $1.2 billion since 2015, and they don't have to pay it back. This is something that is discouraging, but it also fuels us to push for affordable clean energy across the state, for energy that doesn't pollute our homes. It pushes us to advocate for things like the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative that puts money back into our pockets by holding polluters accountable. And it pushes us to support things like the Virginia Clean Economy Act, which is, as I said before, the most significant climate policy in the South, and great for families across our state. Clean energy and any sort of bill that can lower people's electric bills and provide assistance for poor people across our state is going to be important. And just being here today to learn all of this is a huge first step in the direction for securing all those things for people. I know that Jenny put an action in the chat that we can all take right now. Those will be continued to send out to all of our bases. As you all know, if you are on our list, if you are not, please sign up. But Jenny did drop a general action alert to let your lawmakers know that you appreciate their work and urge the governor to do the right thing, and to sign the bills that really matter to us. So thank you all so much for being here. Thank you so much to our panelists. What an incredible group of people and incredible minds. And thank you to Jenny for organizing. Really appreciate it. Grace as well. And yeah, I really am looking forward to seeing the work that we continue to do. So thank you all. And have a great rest of your Monday.